What would you do if a teenager with nothing to his name walked into your life and quietly returned something that meant more than money ever could? It was a cool evening in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place where people still notice when a truck drives by too slowly and where the lights inside a neighborhood bar glow like a lighthouse after dark. Inside the Crossroads Tavern, conversations moved at an easy pace. Men and women who had known each other for decades sat nursing coffee or something stronger, talking about work, about weather, about grandchildren. Nothing about that night suggested it would be remembered. Then the door opened, and in stepped Ethan Parker, 18 years old, thin from too many skipped meals, shoulders tight the way young men carry themselves when they expect the world to push back. In his hand, resting against his palm as if it carried more weight than metal should, was a silver ring, worn smooth along one edge. Ethan did not know what it represented. He only knew he had found it near a gas station on the edge of town, glinting under a flickering light after the rain. He could have pawned it. He could have traded it for a few nights in a motel or a bus ticket out. According to national housing reports, tens of thousands of teenagers across the United States experience homelessness each year, many drifting between couches, shelters, and streets. More than 40% come from homes marked by instability or fear. Ethan was one of those quiet statistics. But something in him refused to keep what was not his. When he stepped further inside, conversation slowed. At a table near the back sat Daniel Carter, 52 years old, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, a man who had spent a lifetime learning the difference between strength and noise. The ring Ethan held had once belonged to him. It was given to Daniel years earlier after a difficult chapter that tested his loyalty and his resolve. It was not expensive in the way jewelers measure value. It was expensive in memory. Ethan approached him without drama, without rehearsed speech. He simply said he believed the ring belonged to someone here and that it did not feel right keeping it. His voice did not shake from fear of the men in the room. It trembled because he was tired.
Tired of moving. Tired of not belonging anywhere. Daniel took the ring slowly. The tavern was quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. In that stillness, something passed between them that had nothing to do with motorcycles or reputations. It was recognition. Daniel saw in Ethan a version of himself from long ago, before he learned how quickly life can harden a man who feels unseen. Ethan had been sleeping wherever he could find cover, behind a hardware store, on the back steps of a closed diner. He had left home months earlier, after realizing that staying meant shrinking into someone he did not want to become. No details were offered, and none were needed. Across this country, thousands of young people make similar decisions each year, not because they seek adventure, but because they seek breathing room. When Daniel asked him where he was staying, Ethan answered plainly that he did not have a place. He did not know who Daniel was. He did not know the history tied to that ring. He only knew that carrying it felt wrong. There is a moment in every man's life when he understands that character is built not in comfort, but in quiet choices no one may ever applaud. Ethan had made such a choice. He had walked into a room full of strangers and returned something valuable without asking for reward. In a world that often teaches young people to grab what they can before it disappears, that kind of decision is rare. Daniel nodded once and told the bartender to bring the young man a meal, not as payment, not as charity, just as acknowledgement. As Ethan sat down and began to eat slowly, as if unsure when the next meal might come, Daniel felt the weight of the ring settle back onto his hand. It no longer felt like a relic of the past. It felt like a question. What do you do when integrity shows up at your door wearing worn-out shoes and carrying nothing but a steady conscience? That night at the Crossroad Tavern, before any rumors spread and before any pressure arrived from outside, the real story had already begun. It began with an 18-year-old who refused to let hardship decide his values, and it began with a 52-year-old man who realized that sometimes leadership is less about protecting what you built and more about protecting what is right in front of you.
By the time the plates were cleared and the last of the regulars drifted out into the night, Daniel Carter understood that the ring returning to his hand was not the end of something. It was the beginning of responsibility. Daniel was not a perfect man, and he never pretended to be. At 52, he had lived long enough to know that pride can ruin good judgment, and that anger, when left unchecked, solves very little. Over the years, he had built the Iron Ridge Riders into something steadier than the stereotypes people often attach to men who ride together. They were business owners, mechanics, veterans, fathers and grandfathers. They paid taxes. They volunteered quietly. They also carried histories that had not always been easy. What troubled Daniel was not the ring itself, it was the attention it might draw. Sheriff Robert Hayes had been in office for nearly a decade. At 55, he carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who understood the influence of paperwork, policy, and public opinion. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. In towns like theirs, authority often moves through official letters, inspection notices, and carefully worded press statements. Within a day of Ethan's visit, questions began to circulate. A deputy stopped by the Crossroad Tavern asking routine-sounding inquiries about a missing personal item tied to an ongoing review. A local reporter mentioned that the sheriff's department was clarifying certain matters involving community organizations. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just enough to plant doubt. Daniel recognized the pattern. In America, power does not always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives with forms to sign and cameras already positioned at the curb. Ethan felt the shift before anyone explained it to him. He noticed how conversations lowered when he entered the room. He heard the careful way people used his name. When he was asked to come to the station for what was described as a brief conversation, his shoulders tightened again in that familiar way. For a young man who had spent months trying not to be noticed, stepping into a government building under fluorescent lights carried its own weight. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, hundreds of thousands of reports involving missing or runaway youth are filed each year across the United States. Most of those young people are not criminals. They are adolescents navigating instability without a map. Yet once they enter official systems, their stories can be shaped by adults with louder voices. Daniel knew that. He drove Ethan to the station himself, not to intimidate anyone and not to interfere, but to make something clear without saying it directly. This young man was not alone. Inside, Sheriff Hayes greeted them with practiced politeness. He asked Ethan where he had found the ring. He asked how long he had been in town. He asked whether anyone had encouraged him to return it. The questions were reasonable on the surface, yet Daniel heard the undertone. If a narrative could be built in which Ethan was connected to wrongdoing, even loosely, it would not take much for public opinion to tilt. Ethan answered honestly. He said he found the ring near a gas station after a rainstorm. He said no one had told him to bring it back. He said he simply believed it belonged to someone who might miss it. His voice was steady, though his hands gripped the edge of the chair. When they left the station, Ethan finally spoke the doubt that had been building. He asked Daniel whether returning the ring had caused trouble. He wondered if he should have stayed invisible. It is a painful thing to watch a young person question the very integrity that makes them strong. Daniel pulled the truck to the side of the road and looked at him carefully. He explained that doing the right thing does not guarantee an easy outcome. In fact, sometimes it invites scrutiny. But integrity, once compromised, is far harder to recover than reputation. Back at the clubhouse, the Iron Ridge riders gathered around a long wooden table worn smooth by years of discussion. Mike Turner worried aloud that increased attention could hurt their businesses. Kevin Brooks spoke about the importance of staying within the law and documenting every interaction. Sarah Mitchell, whose work as a nurse had taught her to read exhaustion in a glance, reminded them that Ethan had not slept well in days and that pressure could push him back onto the road. The room was not divided by anger, it was divided by concern. Leadership, Daniel understood, is not about commanding agreement, it is about holding tension without letting it tear the group apart. He listened to every voice before speaking. Then he said something simple.
The young man had returned what was not his. If they responded by distancing themselves out of fear, what would that say about their own values? There are moments when communities reveal who they truly are, not in parades or public celebrations, but in quiet decisions about whether to protect the vulnerable. Across the United States, countless organizations claim to stand for family and loyalty. Fewer are tested by the unexpected arrival of someone who needs both. Daniel chose to stand firm, not aggressively, not recklessly. He instructed Kevin to ensure that any future communication with the sheriff's office was documented. He asked Mike to keep an eye on the tavern without escalating tension. He told Sarah to make sure Ethan had a safe place to rest. Above all, he made it clear that they would respond with transparency, not hostility. As the meeting ended and the room slowly emptied, Daniel remained seated for a moment longer. He thought about the difference between survival and principle. Survival protects what you have today. Principle shapes what you become tomorrow. Outside, the town looked unchanged. Streetlights glowed, traffic moved. But beneath the surface, lines were being drawn. Sheriff Hayes was testing influence. The riders were testing resolve. And at the center of it all stood an 18-year-old young man who had simply decided that honesty mattered. Sometimes the greatest pressure does not come from open conflict. It comes from the quiet question of whether you will bend. In the days that followed, the pressure did not explode, it accumulated. Local news outlets began running carefully worded segments about community oversight and ongoing inquiries. No direct accusations were made, yet the implication lingered in the air like humidity before a storm. A camera crew appeared outside the garage owned by one of the Iron Ridge riders, asking neutral questions about business practices. Online forums filled with speculation from people who knew nothing about Ethan Parker but felt comfortable debating his character. This was how influence worked in modern America, not always through confrontation, but through repetition. Say something often enough, and it begins to sound like truth. Sheriff Robert Hayes maintained his calm public posture. At 55, he understood optics. He spoke about transparency. He emphasized procedure. He mentioned that young people in unstable situations sometimes become unwitting participants in larger matters. It was subtle language, but it shifted responsibility onto shoulders that were barely broad enough to carry adulthood. Ethan felt it everywhere he went. A glance that lingered too long at the grocery store. A pause in conversation when he walked into a room. For a young man who had spent months feeling invisible, this new kind of visibility was disorienting. Visibility without protection can feel like exposure. Back at the clubhouse, the riders faced their own test. Mike Turner worried that customers might hesitate to walk through their doors. Kevin Brooks reviewed public records and reminded everyone that staying organized and lawful was their strongest defense. Sarah Mitchell noticed the way Ethan's sleep grew restless again. Trauma does not need loud triggers. Sometimes uncertainty is enough.
Daniel Carter watched all of it with the patience of someone who had learned that reacting too quickly can close doors that careful thought might open. He gathered the group one evening and spoke in a measured tone. He reminded them that escalation would serve no one. If there were questions, they would answer them. If there were accusations, they would request evidence. If there were misunderstandings, they would correct them through proper channels. Leadership, he said, is measured by how we behave when we feel cornered. Meanwhile, Kevin uncovered something worth examining. In reviewing recent county expenditures and internal memos that were publicly accessible, he noticed inconsistencies in how certain investigations were prioritized. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on its face, but enough to suggest that the sheriff's office might not be as impartial as it claimed. Anthony Ramirez, an old acquaintance of Daniel's, who now worked in regulatory compliance, helped interpret the paperwork. What they found was not scandalous in a cinematic sense. It was procedural. Patterns of selective enforcement, timing that coincided conveniently with political pressure. In the United States, systems rely on documentation. When those documents are examined carefully, they often tell stories that speeches do not. Daniel made a decision that surprised some of the riders. Rather than confront Sheriff Hayes privately, he requested a public meeting at the county building, not to argue, not to accuse, but to ask clear questions in an open setting. Transparency, he believed, protects everyone involved. The day of the meeting arrived under a gray sky. Community members filled folding chairs. A few reporters set up cameras. Daniel walked in wearing plain clothes, not the symbols of his club.
He carried a folder containing copies of the records Kevin and Anthony had reviewed. Ethan sat near the back beside Sarah, hands folded tightly, but eyes forward. Sheriff Hayes spoke first, reiterating his commitment to safety and accountability. Then Daniel stood. His voice did not rise. He acknowledged the sheriff's duty. He acknowledged the importance of oversight. Then he calmly asked why certain complaints were pursued aggressively while others were left unresolved. He referenced dates. He cited publicly available documents. He asked for clarification, not confrontation. There is a power in asking questions that demand thoughtful answers. The room shifted. What had begun as a narrative about a runaway teenager slowly became a conversation about process, about consistency, about fairness. Reporters leaned in. Community members murmured. Sheriff Hayes maintained composure, but for the first time, the balance of attention tilted. An internal review was announced within weeks. It was procedural and measured. No dramatic arrests, no public humiliation, just a quiet examination of whether authority had been applied evenly. For many watching, it was a reminder that institutions function best when citizens remained engaged and informed. Through it all, Ethan observed. He saw that Daniel had chosen patience over anger. He saw that standing firm did not require shouting. He began to understand that integrity is not only about returning a lost ring, it is about remaining steady when your name is spoken in rooms where you are not present. When the review concluded, it recommended adjustments in oversight and clearer communication between departments. Sheriff Hayes retained his position, but the scrutiny changed how he operated. Influence, once unquestioned, now carried accountability. The riders returned to their routines, businesses reopening without hesitation. Conversations at the Crossroad Tavern grew easier again. But something fundamental had shifted. They had faced pressure without fracturing. They had responded to suspicion with documentation instead of defiance. One evening, as the sun lowered over the highway, Ethan sat outside the clubhouse with Daniel. The young man looked older than 18 now, not in years, but in awareness. He asked Daniel whether it had been worth it, whether the stress and attention justified one honest act. Daniel considered the question carefully.
In a country as vast and complicated as ours, he said, it is easy to believe that individual choices disappear into the noise. But systems improve only when ordinary people insist on clarity, and communities grow stronger when they protect the integrity of their most vulnerable members.
Sometimes justice does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with patience. Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time since he had walked into the Crossroad Tavern, he did not look like someone waiting to leave. He looked like someone deciding to stay. In the weeks that followed, life did not return to what it had been. It moved forward, which is not the same thing. The internal review brought adjustments to county procedures and clearer standards for how inquiries were initiated and communicated. There were no dramatic headlines, no cinematic downfall, just policy revisions, new reporting guidelines, and a community that had been reminded that oversight works best when it is mutual. Sheriff Robert Hayes continued in his role, but the tone of his office shifted. Questions were answered more directly. Decisions were documented more carefully. Influence, once assumed, now required explanation. At the Crossroad Tavern, conversations regained their warmth. Customers who had hesitated returned without ceremony. The Iron Ridge riders resumed their routines, not with triumph, but with steadiness. Mike Turner reopened the garage doors each morning. Kevin Brooks kept organized files with quiet satisfaction. Sarah Mitchell made sure Ethan attended a local job training program and connected him with a housing coordinator who specialized in transitional placements for young adults. Across the United States, programs like these exist in every state, built on the belief that stability in early adulthood can change the course of an entire life. Ethan, for the first time in months, had a mailing address that was not temporary. One evening, long after the news cycle had moved on, Daniel Carter sat at a wooden table in the clubhouse, the silver ring resting between his fingers. It had traveled a strange path, lost in the rain, found by a young man with no reason to return it except conscience, carried into a room that could have turned cold but did not. Ethan stood nearby, taller now in posture, if not in height. At 18, he had already learned lessons many do not encounter until much later. He had learned that doing the right thing may invite scrutiny. He had learned that adults do not always agree. He had learned that systems can feel intimidating, but he had also learned that some people will stand beside you when it counts. Daniel looked at him and asked a simple question. Did he still believe returning the ring had been the right choice?
Ethan did not hesitate this time. He said yes, not because it had been easy, not because it had worked out neatly, but because he would not have recognized himself if he had chosen otherwise. Daniel nodded slowly. Then, in a gesture that surprised even himself, he closed Ethan's fingers around the ring. He explained that objects change meaning when the story around them changes. The ring had once represented survival through hardship. Now it also represented integrity found in unlikely places. He told Ethan that leadership is not about age or titles or patches sewn onto fabric. It is about the quiet decision to hold on to your values when no one would blame you for letting them go. Ethan tried to refuse at first. He said it did not belong to him. Daniel answered that sometimes belonging is not about ownership, it is about stewardship, about carrying forward what has been learned. At a small community gathering weeks later, Daniel spoke briefly, not about conflict, but about responsibility. He reminded those listening that in a nation as large and diverse as ours, it is easy to feel that individual actions disappear into statistics. We read numbers about youth homelessness. We hear reports about institutional reviews. We debate policies from a distance. Yet behind every number is a name. Behind every headline is a choice someone made. He spoke as a man who had lived long enough to see trends come and go. What endures, he said, is character. Ethan stood at the edge of that gathering, the ring secure in his pocket. He was no longer simply the teenager who had walked into a bar with shaking hands. He was a young adult with a plan, enrolled in classes, working part-time, rebuilding trust in himself. He had not been rescued in a dramatic sense. He had been recognized, and sometimes recognition is the first form of stability. As the sun lowered over the highway outside town, the riders prepared for an evening ride. Engines started one by one, not as a display, but as a ritual of connection. Daniel mounted his motorcycle and looked over at Ethan, who watched with a thoughtful expression. There was no pressure for him to join, no expectations placed upon him beyond continuing to choose wisely. Before they pulled out, Daniel offered one final reflection, the kind a man shares when he understands that stories matter more than slogans. He said that integrity rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, often carried by those the world overlooks. And when it does, we are given a choice. We can dismiss it, doubt it, or protect it. Communities are shaped by which option we take. The riders eased on to the open road, engines low and steady, not racing toward conflict, but riding into ordinary evening light. Ethan remained on the sidewalk, hand resting over the ring in his pocket, feeling its weight, not as burden, but as reminder. In a country built on ideals that are tested every generation, the smallest act of honesty can steady more ground than we realize. And sometimes, when one young man decides that character matters, an entire community is invited to remember what it stands for.